In the early 1960s, a team of scientists landed on a remote, sun-blasted island at the very bottom of the Galapagos and came back with a number so small it barely counted as a population. 14. 14 giant tortoises scattered across an entire island for an animal that should have numbered in the thousands. 12 of them were female, only 2 were male. And those 2 males were so far apart, across miles of bare lava and thorn scrub, that in the wild they had almost no chance of ever finding the females at all. By every rule of biology, this was not a species you rescue. It was a species you write the obituary for. And then, someone remembered a tortoise living 4,500 kilometers away, behind a low wall, in a zoo in California. His name was Diego. He was a giant tortoise of that exact same island, taken from it decades earlier and shipped off to San Diego, which is how he got the name. Nobody had any idea when they put him on a plane back to the equator in 1976 that this single animal was about to become one of the most consequential individuals in the history of modern conservation. Because over the next 40 years, Diego and a tiny handful of other tortoises would father a line of offspring numbering in the thousands. Roughly 2,000 young tortoises bred by hand, raised in pens, and carried back to the island their parents came from. An island that, by any honest measure, had been left for dead. And in 2020, when it was finally over, when the species was declared stable enough to stand on its own, Diego, by then thought to be over 100 years old, was loaded into a crate one last time and taken home. I'm Edmund Hale, and this is the story of how a species came back from 14 animals. The island that nearly lost everything, the breeding program that ran for half a century, and the genuinely strange twist hiding inside the legend of the tortoise who supposedly saved his entire kind. Because the story you've probably heard, the heroic one, with Diego as the tireless father of a species, is mostly true. But the part nobody puts in the headline is, I think, even better. Stay with me, because the science underneath this is stranger and more honest than the legend. But first, you need to understand the animal, and the island, because the two are impossible to separate. The island is called Espanola. It's the oldest and one of the most southerly of the Galapagos Islands, a low, weathered slab of old lava sitting alone in the Pacific, battered by surf, baked by the equatorial sun. It is not a lush place. For much of the year, it's gray and dry and thorned, more bone than jungle. And the giant tortoise that evolved there, Chelonoidus hoodensis, is built for exactly that hardship. It is what biologists call a saddleback tortoise. Its shell doesn't dome smoothly over the body like the giants on the wetter islands. Instead, the front of the shell rises up in a high arch, like the pommel of a saddle, leaving the neck free to stretch upward. And that one feature tells you everything about how this animal lived. On a dry island where the food worth eating, the pads and fruit of the tall prickly pear cactus, grew up out of reach, the tortoise that could lift its head highest ate. The saddleback shell is the fingerprint of 100,000 years of drought. And these animals were not just passengers on Espanola, they were its engineers. A giant tortoise is a slow, relentless force on a landscape. It crops the low vegetation, it tramples paths through the scrub, it knocks down woody growth simply by pushing through it, and it carries seeds, especially cactus seeds, across the island in its gut, and drops them, fertilized and ready, far from the parent plant. On an island this small and this fragile, the tortoise wasn't living in the ecosystem. The tortoise, to a real degree, was building it. Remember that, because it becomes the whole point later on. So how does an animal that shaped an entire island end up reduced to 14 survivors? It happened the way these collapses usually happen, in waves, and each one cut deeper than the last. The first wave was hunger. Not the tortoises, ours. From the 17th century onward, the Galapagos became a refueling stop for the roughest traffic on the ocean. Buccaneers, then whalers, then sealers, crews who spent months and years at sea with no way to keep fresh meat. And the giant tortoise, to those crews, was not a wonder of evolution. It was the most convenient food source ever discovered. A giant tortoise can survive for months, sometimes the better part of a year, without food or water, which meant a ship could stack live tortoises in its hold, upside down, alive, and have fresh meat on demand for the entire voyage. They were, in the cold logic of the age, living tins of food. The records that survive are staggering. Over the whaling era, crews are estimated to have taken something on the order of 100,000 or more tortoises out of the Galapagos. And the saddlebacks of the dry southern islands, easy to find on open ground, were hit hardest of all. Espanola's tortoises were carried off by the shipload, decade after decade, until the island had almost none left. The second wave didn't have to eat a single tortoise to finish the job. It was the goats. At some point in the 1800s, goats were put ashore on Espanola, as they were across the Galapagos, the idea being a handy meat supply for whoever passed through. Goats on an island with no predators do exactly one thing. They multiply, and they eat. They stripped Espanola. They went after the very vegetation the tortoises depended on, the grasses, the seedlings, the cactus. They chewed the island down to dust and bare rock. So even the few tortoises that had survived the whalers were now starving on land that had been eaten out from under them, on an island so degraded the soil itself was blowing away. And here is the cruel arithmetic of it. With the tortoises gone, there was nothing left to disperse the cactus seeds or keep the scrub in check. And with the goats stripping everything that did grow, the tortoises had nothing to recover on. The island had been knocked into a downward spiral, and it had no way to climb back out on its own. By the time scientists properly surveyed Espanola in the early 1960s, what they found was the end stage. 14 tortoises, 12 females, 2 males, spread so thin across the island that breeding in the wild had effectively stopped. They weren't a population anymore. They were the scattered last pieces of one. The species was, for all practical purposes, finished. That was the situation, and the response to it became one of the longest, most patient gambles in conservation history. The decision was made to do something that sounds almost desperate when you say it out loud. Gather them up. Every single one. In the 1960s, those 14 surviving tortoises were collected from Espanola and moved to the Charles Darwin Research Station on the island of Santa Cruz, to a purpose-built breeding center. The logic was stark. Out on Espanola, scattered and starving, these animals would never breed and would simply die out one by one. Brought together, fed, protected, and encouraged to reproduce, they were the species' only remaining chance. 12 females and 2 males. That is what the future of an entire kind of animal had been reduced to. A founding population you could fit in the back of a single truck. And 2 males, genetically, is dangerously few. Which is where Diego comes in. Because around the same time, researchers tracking down tortoises in the world's collections realized that a male Espanola tortoise, one of the rarest animals on Earth, had been sitting in the San Diego Zoo for decades. He'd most likely been taken from the island in the early 20th century, during one of the big scientific collecting expeditions, and had lived out a quiet captivity in California ever since. He was, in effect, a piece of Espanola that had been removed before the collapse and preserved by accident. In 1976, he was repatriated, flown back to the Galapagos and added to the breeding group. 3 males now, instead of 2. And Diego, it turned out, was not a quiet animal. He was big, he was bold, and he was, to put it politely, extremely motivated. Keepers described him as dominant, loud, active, constantly courting, a tortoise with an enormous personality and an even more enormous appetite for reproduction. In a breeding program that lived or died on whether these animals would actually mate, Diego threw himself at the job with a kind of relentless enthusiasm that made him the obvious star. And the offspring came. Year after year, the center incubated the eggs, raised the hatchlings safe from predators until their shells were hard enough to survive, and then repatriated them to Espanola. Over the decades, the program produced and returned roughly 2,000 tortoises to the island, and Diego, the charismatic giant from the San Diego Zoo, became the face of the whole thing. The press loved him. The story wrote itself. The single, heroic male who came home and fathered a species back from the edge. And now, the twist. Because when geneticists actually tested the offspring, the legend got complicated in the most fascinating way. A study led by researchers at Yale University set out to do something simple and overdue. Take DNA from the repatriated tortoises and work out who their parents actually were. Diego, everyone assumed, would turn out to be the father of the lion's share. He was the dominant male, the famous one, the tireless breeder. But that is not what the genetics said. When the paternity came back, Diego was responsible for something like 40% of the offspring. A huge contribution, no question. Hundreds of young tortoises carry his genes. But the majority, around 60%, traced back not to Diego, but to one of the other males. A tortoise with no name in the press, known mostly by his pen number. An animal far less showy, far less dramatic, far less interested in performing for anyone. The quiet one. While Diego was busy being a legend, the unglamorous male in the next enclosure was quietly out-fathering him. I love this detail, and I want to be honest about why it matters, because it is very easy to tell this story wrong. The popular version, Diego single-handedly saved his species, makes for a beautiful headline, and it flattens something more interesting into a fairy tale. The truth is that no single tortoise saved anything. The recovery was the product of 3 males and 12 females, decades of unglamorous human labor, and at least one quiet, overlooked animal who did more of the actual work than the celebrity ever got credit for. Diego was real, and his contribution was real, and he absolutely belongs in this story. But the species was saved by a team, most of it anonymous, some of it human, some of it tortoise. And the most prolific father of the next generation was an animal almost nobody has ever heard of. But breeding tortoises in pens on Santa Cruz was only ever half the battle. Because there was no point in raising 2,000 young tortoises if the island you sent them back to was still the eaten-out wasteland the goats had made. You cannot rebuild a species on dead ground. So while the breeding center did its slow work, an even harder campaign was being waged on Espanola itself, getting rid of the goats. And this is one of the genuinely remarkable, undertold pieces of the whole saga. Over the 1970s, the Galapagos National Park ran a sustained eradication effort to remove every last goat from the island. On an island the size of Espanola, with that terrain, hunting out an entire population of fast-breeding, well-hidden animals down to the final few is brutally difficult work. But by around 1978, it was done. For the first time in over a century, Espanola had no goats on it at all. And the island began, slowly, to breathe again. The vegetation that had been chewed to the roots started to come back, the grasses returned, and crucially, the tortoises being repatriated now had something to eat and something to do. Because as those young tortoises grew and spread across the island, they switched the engine back on. They began grazing, trampling, opening up the scrub, and carrying cactus seeds across the island the way their ancestors had for tens of thousands of years. The animal that had been missing from the machinery of Espanola was back in place, and the machinery started turning again. There is one more thread to this, and it's the one that I think proves the whole point about why these animals matter beyond themselves. Espanola is not only the home of these tortoises, it is, almost entirely, the home of one of the most spectacular seabirds on Earth, the waved albatross.
Nearly the entire world population of that bird breeds on this one island, and almost nowhere else. And here's the connection that ties the tortoise to the albatross in a way that genuinely surprised people. A waved albatross is an enormous bird, and to get airborne, it needs a runway, a clear, open stretch of ground it can waddle along to build up enough speed to launch off the cliffs. When goats stripped the island, there was bare ground everywhere. But there was a real concern that if Espanola were left to grow back wild and woody, with no large grazer to keep it open, the vegetation could close in over those albatross runways and start crowding out the very takeoff strips the birds need to breed. And the animal best suited to keeping that ground open, naturally, for free, forever, is a giant tortoise, grazing and trampling its way across the landscape. Bring back the tortoise, and you are not just saving the tortoise. You may be keeping the runways clear for an albatross that has nowhere else on the planet to go. That is what a keystone species is. Pull it out, and things you never connected to it start to fall. Put it back, and they start, quietly, to recover. It's worth pausing on just how close this came to going the other way, because the Galapagos has the perfect, heartbreaking counterexample. On another island in the same archipelago, Pinta, the tortoises were reduced not to 14, but to 1. A single male, found in 1971, the last of his entire kind. They called him Lonesome George, and for 40 years he became the most famous tortoise on the planet, a living symbol of extinction. Conservationists tried everything to get him to breed with females from the closest related populations. Nothing took. No viable offspring, not one. And in 2012, Lonesome George died, and his entire lineage died with him. The Pinta Island tortoise is gone, forever. That is what the bottom of the curve actually looks like. That is what was waiting for Espanola if those 14 animals had been 13 or 12 or had simply refused to breed. The difference between a triumphant recovery and a permanent extinction can be agonizingly thin. Espanola had just enough left and just enough help to make it. Pinta did not. By 2019 and 2020, the surveys told a story almost nobody in the 1960s would have dared predict. The tortoise population on Espanola had climbed past 2,000 animals. More importantly, they were breeding on their own, in the wild, on the island, without human help. Young, wild-born tortoises were turning up across Espanola. The population was no longer a collection of repatriated individuals being topped up from a center. It was becoming, again, a functioning wild population that could carry itself. And on the strength of that, the decision was made that no conservationist gets to make very often. The breeding program had succeeded. It could stop. So in June 2020, after more than 50 years, the Center on Santa Cruz returned its founders to the wild. 15 of the original adult breeding tortoises, the animals that had started the whole thing, were taken back to Espanola, and among them was Diego. Over 100 years old, the better part of a century since he'd last touched the soil of the island he was born on, the tortoise from the San Diego Zoo went home for good. He had outlived the entire crisis. He had been taken from Espanola before most living people were born, preserved by sheer chance behind a wall in California,
flown back across an ocean, and spent 40 years helping rebuild the exact population he'd been stolen from. And then he walked back out onto the island, into a landscape that was alive again, partly because of him. I want to be careful here, the way the scientists themselves are careful, not to wrap this up too neatly.
The recovery of the Espanola tortoise is one of the great conservation success stories of the last century, and it deserves every bit of that. But it is not finished, and it was not free, and it was not magic. It took 50 years. It took collecting the last 14 animals off the island and gambling that they would breed in captivity. It took an entire separate war against the goats. It took raising and carrying 2,000 tortoises back by hand. The genetic base is still narrow, built from very few founders, and a population rebuilt from so few animals carries risks that will play out over centuries, not years. This was not a case of stepping back and letting nature heal itself, which is how a lot of comeback stories go. This was the opposite. This was decades of intense, hands-on, deeply human intervention, because the damage had gone so far that nature, left alone, would simply have finished the job and let the species die. And that, I think, is the real lesson buried in it.
We did this. The collapse was ours. The whalers, the goats, a century of treating a unique animal as either food or an afterthought. And the recovery was ours too. Slow and patient and unglamorous, mostly carried out by people whose names you'll never know, and at least one tortoise whose name you'll never know either. There's a detail I keep coming back to. The word Galapagos itself comes from an old Spanish word for a kind of saddle, the very saddle shape of these tortoises' shells. The whole archipelago, one of the most famous wild places on Earth, is named after this animal. For a long stretch of history, we very nearly turned that name into a memory. An entire island chain named after a creature we were systematically wiping off it, island by island. On Espanola, the name almost became a gravestone. And instead, because of 14 survivors, 3 males, a breeding center, a war on goats, and the better part of 100 years, it didn't. The island still has its tortoises.
The name still points at something alive. If this story moved you the way it moved me, let me know in the comments, and tell me whether you think the quiet, overlooked male deserves more credit than the famous one ever got. If it changed the way you think about what it actually takes to bring a species back from the very edge, share it with someone who'd appreciate it. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you'd ever believe, and I've got plenty more to tell you. I'm Edmund Hale. Thanks for watching.